For the past 17 years, I've been organizing and leading small group trips around the world, anywhere from 4 to 10 people typically, everywhere from India, Cambodia, Vietnam, Bhutan, Nepal, Antarctica, Cuba, all over the world. I've got over 30 itineraries and have done over 130 trips with groups, plus over 200 probably here in the US. But I teach travel photography. I also teach travel tips. And as I've grown older, I've become much more aware of mindfulness and the importance that it plays in travel.
Unlost Cause is a community that shares stories of individuals 40 and beyond who found the courage to reclaim their dreams and live without regrets. I'm David New, and I hope these stories help you find joy, purpose, and passion in a life true to you. Today's guest is Ralph Velasco, known to many as the Continental Drifter, a former financial advisor who reinvented his life after 45, turning a lifelong love of travel and photography into a thriving business. Since making that leap to turn his lost cause into an unlost cause, he's led over 100 international tours, built a devoted online following, and authored the Mindful and Intentional Traveler book series. Ralph, welcome to Unlost Cause. Great. Well, to provide the audience some context, can you summarize in 2 to 3 sentences what the Continental Drifter or your business does?
Sure. For the past 17 years, I've been organizing and leading small group trips around the world, anywhere from 4 to 10 people typically, everywhere from India, Cambodia, Vietnam, Bhutan, Nepal, Antarctica, Cuba, all over the world. I've got over 30 itineraries and have done over 130 trips with groups, plus over 200 probably here in the US. But I teach travel photography. I also teach travel tips. And as I've grown older, I've become much more aware of mindfulness and the importance that it plays in travel and in life in general, really.
Yeah, great. And so before we dive into the other parts, is part of these trips that you put together, is photography a key element to all of them?
It used to be. I started out more as like a photo workshop leader. And then I knocked it down to photo tours, I called them. Then I called them cultural tours with a focus on photography. And now I do mostly cultural tours. And of course, everyone's got a camera. So I've brought that level of photography down a bit because I found out that leading 10 or 12 photo workshops a year is brutal. Yeah, every sunrise, sunset, walking tours and the image reviews and everything, it's just a lot. So I learned very quickly that I needed to bring that expectation down.
Yeah. Okay. So if we rewind the clock a bit, Ralph, and back to, growing up, were you fascinated by photography as a child, or did this love bloom later in life?
Yeah, mostly as a child. My father was a very good photographer, just amateur, just a hobbyist, but he had a very good eye. And so I could appreciate good photography. And I started traveling internationally on my own or with other groups, not the family, when I was 15 and I studied in Spain for a summer. Next summer, I was a volunteer in Peru. The next summer, I was a volunteer in Venezuela. And the following summer, I studied in Mexico City. So for 4 summers straight, from about 15 to 18 years old, I was traveling internationally and, of course, taking pictures. But back then, this is the late 70s, early to mid 80s, that, certainly wasn't digital photography. So it was regular film. And I really enjoyed it. But I always thought that, becoming a paid photographer or to make a living from travel, especially back then in the 80s, seemed like my becoming a rock star or something, virtually unattainable.
And so it sounds like part of your love for photography came from your father, who you probably saw taking photos and that curiosity as a child. What about the love for travel? You mentioned you I think your first solo trip was studying abroad in Spain, but what about before that? Did your family take a lot of trips, or did you host people from different cultures or countries, or well, what do you think sparked that?
That's a great question. We didn't do much travel. I mean, we used to go to Florida about every other year. I'm from Chicago and we were living there. And so we'd go to Florida maybe every other year. But my parents also about every other year would go to Mexico, where my grandfather lived. And about every other time, they would take us. And so I did get some international travel to Mexico before I studied in Spain, but that was with the family and everything. But I'd always been interested in travel. And, back then it was encyclopedias and just, flipping through the encyclopedias and National Geographic and all these wonderful magazines, Saturday Evening Post, and seeing the photography and these amazing places around the world. It's funny, just yesterday I was watching a show with my mom, a travel show, and they went to this town called Gouda, which like the cheese, Gouda, in the Netherlands. And the women were dressed in these specific hats and they had cheese, these big cheese rolls, rounds on like carts. And I told my mom, I said, when I was a kid, you gave me a puzzle that showed these women and these people carrying these carts of cheese. And that was something that really fascinated me. And, here I am, how many years later, we're watching the show and it brought back that memory. So it was things like that. I always say my mom taught me the best skill I could ever have for photography. And she's never picked up a camera in her life. And that was simply to be curious. And so she taught me to do that. And that's kept with me the whole time, all this time. I call it the ABCs of photography is always be curious.
I love that. And then do you remember what was the first camera you owned?
I remember having a Ricoh. I don't know the model number or anything, but it was a Ricoh, Ricoh. And my dad was a Canon shooter, but I ended up being a Nikon shooter.
Family riffs. And did you also have like a dark room and you were developing your own film as well? Or did you just I believe back in those days, you would just go to a pharmacy. That's, I think, what I did as a kid. And then it became mail-in pharmacy or mail-in film development. But if you were really serious, I think people had their own little dark room.
Well, remember Seattle Filmworks, you just told me that you're in Seattle right now. Yep. I remember sending rolls of film to Seattle Filmworks way back when. But I never did have my own darkroom, but I did take a darkroom class after a while. I was in my 30s, but I really enjoyed that. And this is about when digital photography was coming out, early 2000s. But that was really fascinating. I'm glad I got that sort of basis to photography.
So you talked about your grandfather living in Mexico and you being able to go there maybe every other year. But to go to Spain as a 15-year-old solo. And, we talk about helicoptering parents and so forth. It sounds like so wild, even though we're more connected than ever and safer. You can put an Apple tag on people and equipment and so forth. But what sparked that impetus to go Spain and then go solo?
Well, I should tell you that this was with my high school. So I wasn't without adult supervision, but it was without the parents. So that was a high school trip. So was Spain and Venezuela. And then it was actually a college trip to Mexico, those 4 years I told you about.
Got it. So then you share that trying to make money with like a passion of photography and travel it felt so far afield. It felt like being a rock star. So then you went to college, and then where did you go and what did you end up studying?
Sure. So I went to Indiana University School of Business. It was one of the top 5 schools back then in the early 80s. And really enjoyed it. I just had a great time. Really enjoyed going to business school. I had a minor in small business and entrepreneurship. Later on, about 9 years later, I lived in Mexico City another time, and I studied for my MIBA, my Master's in International Business Administration.
And then why did you choose business?
Well, I grew up in a very entrepreneurial family. My grandparents had restaurants. My parents, that was their main field was the restaurant business. So I grew up in the restaurant business. And then when I graduated from college and during college, and I'd been traveling a little bit, I wanted to create some sort of a import export business and, some way to keep me into travel. And that didn't quite happen. And so I bought a restaurant right out of college. I bought a restaurant in my hometown. Yep. And it was a restaurant that I used to go to as a kid. When we were, my parents would give me $3 to go grab lunch at the Dunny's Dog Hut. I changed the name of it to Ralph's Place, and it was, yeah. What else was I going to call it? And it turned out it was a really nice little moneymaker and very, good way to learn responsibility and stuff for a 21-year-old. But I ran that for a couple of years, and then I sold the business. And I said, before I do anything else, I'm going to buy a round the world ticket. And I traveled around the world for 5 months. That was solo by myself. And that was, one of the great experiences of my life, of course.
I think was it one of those open jaw tickets where you just go from destination? You just have to keep going one direction, west or east, right? And what was the itinerary for that around the world?
Yeah, so I flew Chicago, LA, Hawaii, Fiji, New Zealand, Australia, Hong Kong, China, Bangkok, and then a lot of Europe. Yeah, I was like 15 different countries on 5 continents.
So then you have a strong entrepreneurial family background. You dove right in and you bought a restaurant. It's super successful. It sounds like it's very lucrative to fund this around the world travel. And I'm sure you probably had some realizations or kind of self-reflection when you're doing this travel. So then tell me about the re-entry. When you come back to Chicago, what did you end up doing next? And did you ever think like, maybe I should scratch this travel itch, or did it still seem too far afield?
Well, I was super tired, as you can imagine, after 5 months on my own out there. But when I came back, all I wanted to do was travel more after a quick break. But yeah, I worked in the family business for a while because I didn't have a job. Of course, I had sold my business, so I worked in the family restaurant for a while. That was always great because I always had a summer job, and whenever I needed a job, I had one, which was really, really nice. I had some money from the business and I wanted to get into real estate. So I was looking at properties. So I got my real estate license thinking, okay, I'm going to keep my own commissions and stuff. Well, I did that for 3 years, kind of ran through all my money and learned a lot, but never did buy anything. And in hindsight, I do regret it, but in some ways I don't. But anyway, I went out and worked for a friend of mine that had a restaurant in California, my roommate from college. And then that's about when at about 29, I moved to Mexico City to get my MIBA.
Great. So then 29, so let's say you get the international MBA, then share with the audience, like what were some of the broad brush like chapters or waypoints between that and then, when you made that jump, which we'll talk about a lot, which is, when you were a financial advisor before you made that jump, but what were some of the ensuing kind of career stops you had in between?
Yeah, so I was living in Mexico City. I ended up finishing my degree in San Diego, where the school was based, because it was an American school with a campus in Mexico City. At the time, my understanding, it was the only U.S. accredited university in all of Latin America. I'm not entirely sure if that was true, but I ended up finishing my degree around, I guess it was 2001. But it's so funny because I just remembered just a few years ago when all this AI thing came out that I wrote my term paper for, graduating about AI neural networks and, all this stuff that that we're hearing about now. And I have no idea why I chose that subject. I'd never pursued it. I kind of regret not pursuing it now with all that's happening, but that was 25 years ago. So I just thought that was funny when all this AI stuff came out.
And then so then you graduate from San Diego, and then what were some of the kind of main chapters before you became the financial broker?
Yeah, so I did an internship with a local company in San Diego while I was in school. That turned into a job, but they wanted to create a university very similar to the one that I attended in Mexico City and in San Diego, because this was in San Diego. So a lot of the people from the company had gone to that school, were administrators there. So they actually wanted to start their own university. So they asked me to come on and be the director of business development. They kind of ran out of money. Some other things happened. So that fizzled. Anyway, I ended up moving back to Chicago and I opened up another restaurant. And so that was 2001 to 2004. Now, towards the end of that, that was my initial 3-year lease for the restaurant. And I was, having to decide, am I going to sign for another 5 years or am I going to sell the business and do something else? Well, I had opened up in 2001, May of 2001, which was just, 4 or 5 months before 9/11. And here I am in downtown Chicago. Everyone thought Chicago was going to be next. So business just dried up. It was very difficult, but I started catering, which really helped me stay alive. So anyway, to make a long story longer, I ended up taking a yellow pad, and on one side I wrote the things that I really dislike about the restaurant business, having my own business, period, was I had to have a rental. I had to rent a space that was very expensive, and the rent came due every month, whether business was good or bad. I had employees, which was always difficult in the restaurant business. Came home smelling like a French fry every night. What else?
What type of restaurant was it?
That was more of an Italian deli. So, but that was in downtown Chicago, and downtown Chicago kind of dries up at night and right after 9/11. So I ended up selling. So on the other side of that page, I wrote the opposite of those things. I said, I want to work for myself. I want to work from wherever my laptop is. I'm going to take a shower before work, not after, all these little things. And right at that time, I got introduced to digital photography. My cousin had a 1 megapixel camera and he said, check this out. So I kind of got hooked on it and I said, you know what? I bet I could teach people how to use these new digital devices and create some walking tours around the city where I could teach people how to see, develop their photographic eye, but also to use these new digital devices that no one knew how to use. I realized pretty quickly that Chicago probably wasn't the best place for that because the season's limited. So I ended up moving back out to California, which I had been already. And a friend of mine said, why don't you get your broker's license or your financial advisor's license and come out and work for me? And I said, great. So that would get me out to somewhere that I could do this year round. And so at night, I was teaching, how to use your digital camera and to develop your photographic eye at the local city of Newport Beach or Santa Ana College, University of California, Irvine Extension Program, anywhere I could get in front of people, the Orange County Fair, REI, Calumet Photo, everywhere I could get in front of travelers and photographers, I would do. So that's a tip for your listeners. If anyone's looking to develop a business, is perhaps test it out by creating a class around it at your local city. Every city's got, these quarterly magazines that come out and tell you about yoga classes and this and that. And so I saw in there that someone was teaching about the camera already. So I said, why don't I teach people what to point the camera at? Teaching them to see, developing their photographic eye, not just the camera. And that turned, so I started out just sitting across the kitchen table from someone, teaching them how to do their camera, going top to bottom. Then we might go out into the local area, walk on the beach and put some of those tips into practice, talk about composition and things like that. And that turned into half-day tours and then full-day tours in Southern California. Then I had about 25 different tours in Southern California alone. Started doing weekend trips to Joshua Tree, weekend trips to Death Valley. Then I started bringing groups back to Chicago to get a free trip home. And I was like, well, it's amazing how many people had never been to Chicago from Southern California. So maybe I could create some trips back there and get a free trip. And I ended up doing that about 15 times. And then, so I was doing that for about 3 years, part-time, 2 or 3 years. And in September of 2008, we all know what happened. We had the financial crisis.
All right, so I'm gonna pause you right there. So you just shared a really good tip, and for the unlost cause community, let me try to encapsulate what Ralph was saying is that if you have an idea for a lost cause that you want to make an unlost cause or a hobby or a passion, you can start in your local neighborhood or community, like teaching classes, just to get a test, a litmus test of demand before you go all in on it. So can you share with the listeners, like, how did that, so you contacted them, you had a digital photography, did it just take off like a bolt, or was it like a slow burn that gave you more and more confidence, or what was that arc like?
Yeah, it was a fairly slow burn. When you do this and you approach the city to teach a class, there's a process. It takes 6 or 12 months before you can get on the calendar because they're looking a year in advance for what their schedule's going to be. So it does take a while, but it gives you time to put together your program. And then, then I started teaching there, and I would teach, if 3 people showed up, I would teach the class. I didn't care. I was there anyway. And, maybe who knows who they knew, or maybe they turned into a big client. So that worked out really well. And then I started doing a lot of public speaking. So I've been speaking at the travel and adventure shows for the past 14 or 15 years. And that was a really great way to develop my travel business, getting in front of people that are travelers, and everyone's some sort of a photographer. So I would just create these very sort of not generic, but simple, sort of appeal to a lot of people type of photography tips, travel tips. And that had a much bigger base than the really hardcore photo workshop people, who probably knew more than I did a lot of the time, to be honest. So that worked out really well. And so that's where I appealed to a much larger base. And I realized that there was a lot of people that had digital cameras that weren't workshop kind of people, but they still wanted to learn basic information.
And then when you first started and then you started getting paid for this to do these tours that you're assembling, how long, like what was like a typical or your most popular tour? How long was it? And, how many folks, and roughly how much did you charge back in the day?
For a one-on-one, I think I charged $100, and that was for 2 hours. So I made $50 an hour, which I thought was pretty cool to, do what I love to do and sit there and talk about photography for a couple hours. Here's $100. So that was great. But, the walking tours, and then I did like a trip where it was San Diego by train. So we would go from Irvine in Orange County, take the train down to San Diego, shoot around San Diego for a couple hours, then take the train back. And that was a really cool thing. I would do a one-on-one with everyone on the train on the way down. So those were good. And so little by little, it was very slow burn. Then the Chicago trips, those typically filled up. And my groups are only like 6 to 10 people typically. I like the really small group. I had to charge a little bit more, but people really appreciated the small group, especially when you're in a teaching environment.
Yeah, yeah. And, some people are afraid of technology, so that having that extra one-on-one probably gives them a comfort level that they certainly appreciate. And then, so now let's jump back. So the GFC happens 2008, 2009. So tell me, how was the financial advising brokerage business going? And then when this hits, what are the ensuing dominoes that end up falling?
Well, I think there was one domino.
One big one.
One big domino. Now, for 3 years, I'd been doing that. And I love investing. I just don't like, I didn't want to be a stock jockey where I was just, taking trades and selling stocks and bonds. So I was in this little niche called the 1031 exchange, where you sell a property, you get a capital gain on it. You want to roll the capital gain into something else so that you don't pay the taxes. That was something that my mom was just going through, so I had experience with, and I enjoyed it. And that was sort of my niche not a lot of that was happening in Southern California. So I ended up being sort of a stock jockey and not enjoying being an advisor. So I was kind of had one foot, out the door already while I was doing these speaking and trips at night and on weekends. So, the day after the financial crisis, I was like, okay, this is a sign. I'm going to burn the bridges. I said this, I'm doing this full time and I'm going to make this happen come hell or high water. And it's amazing what happens when your back's against the wall and you have to make something happen.
Yeah. So let me just ask, if you hadn't taken those micro steps by testing demand with the local community colleges and schools and then starting to host these tours, would you have had as much bravado or confidence to, with your back against the wall to burn the boats? Or do you think you would have been a little bit more cautious?
Yeah, definitely more cautious. No, I had developed a little bit of a following. Some, core clients that come back again and again, a little bit of a reputation, in the area. So people were finding out about me through word of mouth and stuff. So it worked out really well that way.
Hmm. And then you said, and I remember reading this, that the financial crisis was the best thing that ever happened to me. Was that because it basically forced you to make that decision and rip off the Band-Aid, or is there more nuance to that you want to share?
Yeah, definitely. It just forced me to, it was a kick in the pants that I needed to get out of something that I wasn't enjoying. I was kind of floundering in. I wasn't doing my best at, and to get into this other area where I felt I could sink my teeth into it and really get excited about it. And I, was seeing some light at the end of the tunnel where, okay, there's something here. People are hiring me. They're interested in the trips I'm putting together.
And, I think for the audience, one of the main takeaways that I see here is that, sometimes these disruptive events, getting laid off or, these financial crises, they can be these blessing in disguise, these opportunities to jolt you to action, to doing something that you're like always thinking like, oh, maybe tomorrow or maybe down the road, but this like jolts you into action. It felt like this was the, what you called the kick in the pants that you needed to get going.
Absolutely. It really was. It was a sign.
Yeah. And then I'm curious, when a hobby becomes a job, right? Like, what was that transition like? Was it seamless and just easy because now you just, drag and drop and scaled out? Or was it like, oh, geez, now I got to think about some accounting, or I got to think about this, that, and the other, and have some operations, some customer help or support along the way?
No, there's no doubt about it. I would say that like my job, my business is 3 to 5% photography and maybe 10% travel, but the rest is the administrative part behind the scenes. And some of that I enjoy, but a lot of it I don't, And so I, tried to minimize that. I've now got some really good like virtual assistants and people to help me around the world. So I've, really, I used to be the kind of person that I'd want to do everything myself, and that's just not sustainable. So finally let myself get some help.
And, a question that comes up often in the unlost cause community is around imposter syndrome. But one of the aspects that I think is unique about you, Ralph, is you are ABC, always be curious. And I think ABL, always be learning. You're learning new things. You go to these trips when you're young, you just buy a restaurant straight out of college, you sell it, you get into another one, you exit it, you get into real estate, you exit it, you get into brokerage, you exit. I'm like, wow, that's really admirable about that flexibility and that lack of rigidity. But at the same time, when we're moving into different like silos, it's also like, oh, geez, I don't have as much experience maybe in these areas that other people have, which I think creeps in that imposter syndrome. So I'm curious for you, did you have any of that creep into your mind when you made that jump?
Oh yeah. I still do till this day. You always kind of wonder, but the imposter syndrome, I definitely feel that.
I just admire the fact that you had so much resilience and you're always curious and always learning. So I thought, well, maybe because of that momentum, you're able to have imposter syndrome, the rear view mirror. But it sounds like, you did have your dose of that as well.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And yeah, I've jumped around a lot. People, say, well, what'd you do before, your business? I said, well, it's maybe easier to tell you what I didn't do before my job, before what I'm doing now. But yeah, one of the reasons that I've been able to have this confidence and to be able to move around like that is that I'm single. I've never been married, no children. I've really only got myself to worry about. And so that allows one to be much more, I guess take more risk when it comes to things because, it's not like I've got a family or a big mortgage or something that I have to worry about. I kind of just roll with it and move on to the next. So in that sense, I consider myself very lucky.
And then in terms of like support, right? And, I've been, we're entrepreneurs. So, there is that saying that it's lonely at the top. And I do believe that, like, for example, when I had larger teams and I was considering doing a layoff, I couldn't ask people like, oh, what do you think about this? Because everyone would freak out, right? So you said you're not married and no children. So I'm just curious, like, who is your emotional kind of support? Is it family or is it close friends? Or do you have a network of other solo entrepreneurs or business leaders that you're able to commiserate with?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of all of those things. I tend to do a lot just on my own and kind of just suck it up and deal with it on my own. But I do. My mom is still around. I'm very thankful for that, and she's still really sharp and got a good business mind. She ran 4 restaurants for 45 years, so she's really smart. And so I'll run things by her. Perhaps I'll talk to another entrepreneur that's doing something similar to what I'm doing, ask them if they've had a similar problem. But for the most part, I guess I just kind of try to figure it out myself.
Well, back to the ABC and ABL, right? Always be curious and always be learning.
Yeah, exactly.
So I love travel too. So I want to dive into some of the fun parts around the company. Is you talk about these destinations, and there's some amazing ones there. Do you choose which ones you want to go to, or do you let it be a little bit inbound demand driven where someone calls and says, hey, Ralph, I'd really like to go to X. And you're like, well, I've never been there, so let me create something. Or do you figure out like, no, I actually like Bhutan, so I'm going to create a Bhutan one, and you either come or you don't come?
Yeah, it's more the latter. I tend to go to places that I'm interested in. And I guess I'm pretty standard. So a lot of my clients are too. And I now, after 17 years, I've got a very good feel for what my clients will and won't go for, what they like and don't, the level of, service and the length of the trips, the price of the trips, all these different factors. But I created an online course called Tour Organizer Training, Get Paid to Travel. And in it, I talk about number one, creating a trip that has a special interest. Mine started out to be photography. It's sort of morphed now into food and culture and to people, but it could be language or knitting or shopping or any other kind of cooking. So build your trip around that idea, but also to build pricing, knowing your client, knowing who your demographic is, who you're appealing to, what they would likely pay for a trip, and then it's testing it. I mean, I started out selling trips way too cheap. I'll tell you, probably like most entrepreneurs, I'm thinking, God, if I can make $100 on one person, that's unbelievable, and, now I realize, okay, there's a lot of other expenses and your time and everything.
Yeah, and I'd also point out to the unlost cause community, there's not only just the time value, there's also perception value, right? Like if you're going to a country and the price is super high versus super low, and it might be the exact same trip, like that high price might signal to the prospect like, oh, wait, maybe there's something more about this trip than a low price, because then you're all like, wait a second, that looks a little too rinky dink for me. And so, yeah, I love how you're always testing prices. And then like if people go to like Bhutan or Vietnam or Mexico, like what's the average length of a trip?
Yeah, so going to places like Bhutan, Nepal, India, Cambodia, those are typically 2-week trips because you're probably not going to fly to India for a week-long trip. I am doing more 7, 8, 9-day trips in Europe where it's a much shorter flight for people here in the US. I've got some European clients as well, but the idea is that people can then do something before or after their trip on their own with their husband, wife, spouse, whatever. And I can help with that as well. But the trips are shorter for me too. Those 14-day trips, 10 times a year, that's a lot.
Yeah, because you always have to be on
I'm
because you're
always
the
there and I'm
resource. You
always
can't
on,
take an evening off.
always
Exactly.
jet lagged. Yeah. So that was starting to get to me.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then in terms of like the demographics, are these like the unlost cause community, like the 40 plus set, or is there like a certain kind of band that it tends to coalesce around?
Definitely 40s plus. That's what I say that my demographic is. People that have the time, they have the resources, they have the interest. They're starting to move into this mindful traveler area that I'm exploring now. So they're my people. I'm one of them. So, I like to travel with like-minded people. Too young people, if people are too young, I probably wouldn't have that much in, relation with them, in common with them. But older folks, I'm one of them. So, I'm very in tune with what people like me and this demographic are looking for.
Yeah, no, I think that's another great insight, Ralph, for the community is like initially, like when you were just testing out, you're like, I want to go back to Chicago and get a trip paid for, right? That was you satisfying your own itch for yourself and you knew it. And then boom, that happened. And now you're able to go to these other places but you're still servicing yourself. But if that's the market, you're able to start with a niche and then, grow from there if you want to. So I think that's very wise and a good lesson for everyone to take away from.
Yeah, my clients really enjoy the types of trips that I've created. They often tell me, I just show up. We always do a meet and greet before the trip. When we get to the destination, the first night everyone gets together, probably for the first time physically. We do some WhatsApp group video calls before, the trip starts. But we always talk about, people talk about where they're from, what they do, what they did, and how they met me, how they came upon this trip. And a lot of times clients say, I've traveled with Ralph before. I know what to expect. I know all I have to do is show up and everything else is taken care of. And that's the highest compliment that I can get, that I'm creating these trips that people want to go. They trust me to put together a wonderful trip. So that's really something.
Yeah, and you just touched upon this, and I was going to ask do you have a lot of repeat clientele? Because that's the strongest signal when they're able and willing to open up their checkbook to give you more money because they really trust you.
Absolutely. I get over 50% repeat rate. This last trip I did, everyone was a repeat. If there's no repeats, then you're not growing the business. If it's all repeats, you're not growing the business. If there's no repeats, then no one's coming back on your trip. So that's a problem. So I think that 50-60% repeat is a really good number. Plus I get a lot of referrals, people bringing friends and family. Quick funny story, that trip that I went to Spain in 1979, that's when it was. I don't know if I mentioned the year, but I was 15 and there was a couple other girls on that trip. They were 15, 16 years old. They just came to Spain with me 44 years later. 2 years ago, they came. I hadn't seen them since high school, but we just got back in touch on Facebook and they saw that I'd run tours and they said, we want to go back to Spain. So they came with me. Now they went to France with me last summer or last fall. And this just a month ago, we went to Portugal and they brought their husbands. So it's really, I'm traveling with friends. Especially now that these repeats are people that have been on my trips before. I've got one guy who's been on 25 plus of my trip. Yeah. And he's coming to Patagonia with me in September.
Jeez. All right. So before we talk about the books and mindful traveling, I want to give you an opportunity to have a brag moment. What is one of your favorite memories from, over 100 trips where you're like, wow, that doesn't even feel like I'm working. I can't believe I get paid to do this because you just gave me this gift of a memory or you said something that really touched me.
Yeah, a couple of times I've had clients pull me aside on a trip, probably 3 or 4 times, and say, Ralph, I just want to tell you this is the best trip I've ever been on in my life. And it doesn't get much better than that, when, there's a 60, 70-year-old person that has traveled quite a bit. And I happen to put together what they're calling the best trip of their life. And so those are really cool moments. So I always say, do you mind if I quote you on that? And I add that to my testimonials, and they're always like, sure. So those are what makes me feel good. My job is to share the world with people. So I go to these places typically a year in advance on my own with the local tour operator, guide, often the tour owner, company owner in the destination, because I always work with someone in the destination to help me put together the details. I started doing them myself. I call it the Pain in Spain, was a trip that I wanted to put together myself to Madrid, Segovia, Toledo, and Barcelona. So in the end, I had to talk to 4 different hotels, 4 different guides. I don't know how many restaurants, activities, transportation, 36 vendors I had to call, explain myself to them, tell them why they should work with me, what my history was, which at the time was almost zero. And I said, you know what, this is crazy. So now I work with one person in the destination. They know exactly what I'm looking for because I've told them, and they help me put together a beautiful trip. So I find that I feel like those people are my partners because it's in their best interest to put together a great trip for me and my people. And then we keep coming back over and over again.
So you then started, or recently, I don't know what the timeline is around this mindful traveling or being very intentional as a traveler. So share with the audience, what was the spark for that and how has it manifested?
Yeah, the spark for that happened way, way long ago on that Peru trip. And we were 16-year-old boys. We were a group of 9 boys. I went to an all-boys high school here in Chicago back then. And this was a group trip through the school. Spain was through the same school the year before, but this was Peru the next year. 9 boys with 4 teachers slash a couple of them were priests from our school. It was a Catholic high school. And we went down there for 6 weeks. We were in Peru for a month and a half. And after a couple of days, we're starting to moan a little bit, and we're missing our beds and our mother's cooking and our friends. And so one of the teachers on the trip just pulled us aside. He'd had enough. And he said, guys, be here now. You've got this incredible opportunity to be in this incredible place on the other side of the world. Make sure that you're here physically and mentally to enjoy and take advantage of this experience. So that's always stuck with me, those 3 words, be here now. So I've tried to do that, but I come to realize that as a younger traveler, and I think a lot of younger travelers, it's all about ticking those things off your bucket list and doing as much as possible and just touching on these things and saying that you did them. That's kind of the mindset that I was in. But as I got older, maybe 3, 4 years ago, I started thinking, you know what? It's not about ticking these things off your list. It's about being intentional and being present. And so today, my idea of a great trip is sitting in a cafe, watching the world go by, having a cup of coffee, sitting on a bar stool that's older than the United States of America in a pub in Scotland and having a drink with an old timer. These local experiences, meeting artisans and business people. It's not about just ticking things off a bucket list. And ironically, my next book is called Bucket Lists for Travel, Places to Go Before Your Knees Give Out. And it's a book filled with about 80 different bucket lists from countries and continents, states, national parks, to UNESCO World Heritage Sites, different kinds of cuisines, restaurants, bars, drinks, foods, all these different things, that experiences, skydiving, all the normal bucket list stuff, but a place where you can physically check off your list, but also be reminded of intentionality and mindfulness. because that's super important. Just one book I wrote, I don't have it right here, but it's How to Be a Mindful Traveler Using Your 5+ Senses. And my idea is that every couple hours, set a timer for yourself. And when you hear it, stop, look, listen, feel, touch, taste your surroundings intentionally. Because I find that I go through these trips and I'm like, was I there? I was there physically. I've got the receipts, I've got the pictures, the memories, but I don't remember a whole lot. I spent the whole time with my eye to the viewfinder. And as photographers, we're the worst because that's what we do. We go through a trip with our eyes to the viewfinder and we get some nice shots, but were we really there? So I'm trying for this balance of being mindful and intentional and stopping and really taking in the place, not just ticking things off a bucket list.
So now with the authorship and penning these books, how much of your time and energy is spent on the traditional nuts and bolts of travel versus the books? And how much of it is also intertwined? Do you introduce them together to the clients?
Yeah, so I've been giving out copies of that How to Be a Mindful Traveler book to my clients on trips. So that's really nice. But the combining them so just this past May, I mentioned this trip to Portugal that I did. To me, that was my last group trip, my last group tour that I'm going to lead, my last formal group tour. So I call it pre-tiring. So I'm going to move towards the books, speaking, and doing custom tour design for people. So people that know me, that want to get in touch with me, that like the way my trips run, I could put trips together for them, their family, organization, whatever. They go, I don't have to be the leader, but I know that they're taken care of in the destination. So that's what I'm leaning toward, I'm moving towards. So I would say about half my time is spent with the books and half of the time is with travel and that organization.
And when you're going through this pre-tiring phase, which I like, Ralph, are you going to hire, is there going to be like a kind of intern Ralph or Ralph Jr. who's going to take the mantle? Or are you thinking, no, I'm just going to help plan it and they're on their own? But what if they're like, hey, we like Ralph. Can you train like a new Ralph to come with us?
I haven't thought of training anyone. I have tried to have other leaders take over trips and lead trips for me. And I tried it with 3 different guys and 3 different reasons. They all failed. And, the truth is I realized that I can really only depend on myself. And this business is a type of business that unfortunately it's about me. I started this business. People come on the trips because they know of me or they do know me, but they're coming on the trip because of me. And in a way that was kind of a mistake, but also it's a good thing. Oh, it was a good mistake, I guess.
And then as you're literally turning the chapter and doing more into the writing and then the trip planning and not doing the actually leading as a guide, what would you say are the top 2 things you're most excited about that transition and the top 2 things you're most concerned about?
Well, I'm excited about number one, getting this next book out as part of this series and seeing how that does. And happen to have a copy of it right here, bucket list for travel. But the thing that I'm a little worried about is that, I'm don't have the income that I had before because, the trips were the main income source that I had, but I've been a good saver and, I'm trying to get my money to work for me. And so, I'm not too worried about that part.
And why the shift? Is it because you mentioned that age and jet lag is tougher, or do you feel like you can touch more lives by sharing your wisdom via books versus like the physical constraint of like people traveling with you on a group?
Yeah, it's part of both, but the physical part after 17 years of doing this is starting to get to me. I've got back problems just from planes, trains, and automobiles, and being scrunched up and stuff. So that part is getting old. I'm not getting younger, but 17 years of this, I feel like I've put in a pretty good run. I've got a lot of knowledge, and I could still pass that on through the books and through the other trips. So yeah, it's just a transition that I'm going through right now.
Got it. And then How has, when you burned the boats and started to lean in full time on the Continental Drifter, how did that pursuit and now as you look back on it change how you see yourself?
Well, yeah, it was, it was something at the time that I was pretty comfortable doing, but I was still scared because we were in the financial crisis. I mean, we were at the beginning of this financial crisis. Here I am giving up my job. I wasn't, I didn't have a salary. And I knew that, my boss who'd been in the business for 25 years saw his book go down 90%, and here I am a newbie advisor and I hardly have any kind of a book or clients. So I really wasn't walking away from a whole lot of money. So I just felt like, okay, I'd rather not make money over here for a while, but it's got a lot of promise and I'd love to do it. So I want to spend my time over there.
And then as you reflect, and I know that you still have multiple chapters to go, are you proud of what you've done?
I really am. Sometimes I have to force myself to sit back and really look at it and think about how I should be proud and very appreciative. And I try to be as appreciative as possible. But just, like anything else, things become your new normal. People say you got the best job in the world, which I probably do, but it's not perfect. Nothing is. And it does have its downsides. But I can't imagine anything else that I'd rather be doing than be involved with travel.
Yeah, I see the duality because on the one hand, you're always curious and you're always learning new things, and it feels like that finish line keeps getting pushed out. But then on the other hand, you're like, be present, be intentional, be here now, and then to say like, oh wow, what did I accomplish? Well, that's a lot, and I can be proud of it and take some time to really let that sink in.
For sure. Yes.
And then, so Ralph, if you did not take that leap and you were still in the financial industry and you were on your deathbed, how would you feel about not, taking that jump?
Yeah. Terrible. What could have been, I wrote a book called Niche, Question Your Way to Finding Your Niche. And one of the questions in the book, the best question, I didn't come up with it, but I had heard it and I love it, is what would you have to do if you didn't have to do anything? You're in a financial position, you don't have to work. What are you going to do with your free time? Now that you're in that position, how are you going to spend your time? And so that's always been a really powerful question for me. So I definitely would regret it if I hadn't done this. And I've had 17 years of absolutely incredible, 10, 12 trips a year, over 1,000 clients, meeting people around the world. I mean, it just couldn't be better. If I die tomorrow, I've lived more than most people ever will. So I often remind myself of that.
Kudos to you. And then I don't know if you remember, but I asked you if you were going to encapsulate your memoir or book title about your life. I think you said, I live for today, someday never comes, right? So why would you choose that title?
Well, I Live for Today is actually a picture that was taken of me on my round the world trip when I was in Greece. I was 24. And I've got this picture of me sitting next to this graffiti on a wall in Crete. It says, I live for today. And it's always, it's right in that be here now kind of vein. And, I haven't always lived for today, but now as I get older, I'm realizing the importance of it. They always say youth is wasted on the young. So that's a picture that I love. And I love that saying, I live for today. And then someday never comes, the subtitle is because it doesn't. And we're always, someday I'm going to travel. Someday I'm going to retire. Someday I'm going to do this or that. Well, someday never comes. And as they say, life's what happens while you're making other plans. And next thing you know, you're 60, 70 years old. And, but it's never late to be what you might have been. And I say that, it took me 45 years to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, but most people never do. So I'm very lucky that it only took me that long.
And when you mentioned that photo of you in Europe about I live for today, I'm curious, what is your favorite photo that you've blown up in your house? And it would be great if you can send it to me afterwards and I can put it in the interview so that people can actually see it.
Yeah, sure. I could send you. I live for today as well because I did make a copy of that one. When I think about, I tell the story in my presentation, some of my presentations that I've done, but there's this woman, if you can imagine, a Vietnamese woman wearing the conical non la hat, which is what they're called in Vietnam, and she's in a rice paddy and she's planting rice. And she's with these other ladies, but I'm driving by with my guide and I says, hey, can we pull over? This woman's in this field. I love to capture people, working in their jobs. And so we pull over, we run across the highway, we go start talking to her, and the guy starts talking to her and in Vietnamese. He says to me, he says, Ralph, she's asking what your name is. He says, well, tell her my name's Ralph Velasco. He tells her that. They go back and forth. She's asking what you do for a living. I said, well, I'm a tour operator and I organize tours and I'm here scouting your country and I love it. Tell her that. So he tells her that. He says, where are you from? She says, where are you from? I'm from Chicago. Tells her that. Comes back. Are you single? She had asked him to ask me if I was single. So I've got this wonderful picture of this lady with this big smile, and she's got the non la hat and she's in the rice paddy. And that's a picture that brings a smile to my face. I love the story when I think about it. So that's one of my favorite photos.
Unbelievable. And then as you know, you've already dispensed a lot of wisdom, and for people who have a lost cause and they haven't gotten this maybe big jolt like the financial crisis like you experienced, what is maybe a small step that they can, or even if it's symbolic, take to start thinking about getting a little bit closer to taking action?
Yeah, I think, taking inventory of your life in a way, where you're at, where you want to go, how do you plan to get there? Having an idea where you want to go is always a good idea because you want to, that gives you hope, that gives you a direction, somewhere to aim for. Otherwise, you're kind of just, ship without a rudder. So having something to shoot for and really thinking about that. And, speaking of ChatGPT, ChatGPT is absolutely fantastic. It's like having another person to bounce ideas off of, whether it's life ideas, business ideas, it's so fantastic, especially for a solopreneur like I am, where I don't have people walking around the office that I can bounce ideas off of. I'm by myself. So chat is like having this incredibly smart and experienced partner that you can run ideas by. So don't be afraid to use that.
Yeah. No, amazing. And then what is one ask that you have of the Unlost Cause community?
Yeah, I would like to ask them to really think about, being here now, and every now and then just stopping, looking, listening, feeling, touching, tasting where you are, whether you're traveling or not. This is anywhere in your life, and appreciating the here and now.
Wonderful. So, in closing, at 15, Ralph fell in love with travel. At 45, he finally jumped to turn that lost cause into an unlost cause. He didn't just chase a dream, he built a business and a life aligned with it. If you're sitting on a simmering dream, remember Ralph's comment that sometimes a crisis becomes your greatest gift, and to live for today, someday never comes. And if Ralph's story moved you, please share this episode. Someone else may need to hear it as well. Subscribe, leave a review, and join us at unlostcause.com because your next chapter might be your best one yet. Thanks, Ralph.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Before you go, if you're inspired and want to be a part of something bigger, subscribe, like, and share to help more people reclaim their dreams and live true to themselves. Also, let me know if you or someone you know would be an inspiring guest on this show. Together, let's spark courage to live without regrets. The Unlost Cause way, one story and one person at a time.